The stage road into Hollis Creek was rutted from the spring melt, and the coach took the last bend hard enough that the driver swore aloud, and the springs groaned beneath the body of the carriage like something dying. Harper Whitmore felt the groan through her hip and her shoulder, and the bones of her jaw did not turn her head. She had heard worse sounds blamed on her body. The coach stopped. The driver climbed down, set the step, and muttered, just loud enough, that the team had earned a long rest and the springs would need looking to before the run back. A man on the boardwalk in front of the freight office laughed and said, "Plain enough to carry. That Calder had ordered himself a wife, and got two for the price." Harper put her foot on the step. She put her gloved hand on the doorframe. She lowered herself down with the care of a woman who had been lowering herself down out of coaches her whole life. The step bowed and held. She straightened. She looked at no one. She did not flinch. She did not speak. She did not let her eyes water in the wind. She only whispered to no one, and to herself and to the long road behind her, "I won't be a burden," the way a woman says a prayer that has not yet been answered. And then she lifted her chin and walked toward the wagon where a man waited without moving. He was tall and lean and weather-burned to the color of old saddle leather, and he stood with the reins slack in one hand and his hat pushed back enough that she could see his eyes. He did not look her up and down. He did not glance at the driver to see what the joke had been. He looked at her face, and he kept looking at her face, and when she came within reach of the wagon, he stepped forward and took her carpet-bag from her hand as though it weighed nothing, and as though she did. And something inside her cracked open. If this story already has your chest tight, do me the kindness of hitting that subscribe button and following Harper's story all the way to the end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from tonight. I want to see how far Harper's story travels. It was March of 1883, and the Creek country was still hard with the last of winter. The land out past the freight office rose in long, slow folds toward the blue line of the mountains, and the wind that came down off them carried the smell of melt and pine and wood smoke from the chimneys of the little town. Hollis Creek itself sat in a fold between two ridges, one street long and one church wide, with a meeting hall at the south end and a bank at the north, and the boarding house in the middle. The boards of the walk were warped from 100 winters. The horses tied along the rails steamed in the cold sun. Harper had come out of Missouri on 3 trains and 2 coaches with a single trunk and a carpet-bag, and her hands, in their thin black gloves, were red with the cold and steady. She had not eaten since the way station before dawn. She had not been spoken to by name since St. Louis. She had read the contract folded inside her bag so many times that she could have recited the 4 short paragraphs of it from memory, and the wording of it had been the first kindness done to her in some time. Housekeeper first, the contract said, wife only. If both parties after the season was out consented in writing, a wage either way, a room of her own. Mrs. Whitmore, the man said. It was the first time anyone had said her name aloud. In a week, her throat closed on her. "Miss," she said when she had her voice. "I never married Miss Whitmore." Then he touched the brim of his hat. He did not smile, but the lines around his eyes shifted in a way that was not unkind. Holt Calder. "I appreciate you coming, Mr. Calder. Your trunk on the coach?" "Yes." He went past her toward the boot. The driver had already swung down the trunk and set it on the boards, with a thud meant to be louder than it needed to be. Holt Calder lifted it by the strap and the handle in one motion, and carried it to the wagon without showing any of it in his face. And when he came back he held out both hands to her. She looked at them. They were brown and rough and clean, the knuckles square, the right thumb scarred white across the joint. They were waiting. "It's a tall step," he said. "I know," she said, "both hands, if you'll let me." She let him. He took her by both gloved hands and set his weight against her weight, as a man sets himself to lift a yearling, and she went up onto the seat without the wagon tipping, and without any of the noise she had been bracing for. And when she was settled, he climbed up the other side and gathered the reins and clucked once to the team. The wagon rolled. The town slid past her shoulder. The boardwalk man was still standing in front of the freight office, but he had stopped laughing. "Your trunk looks light," Holt said, after a long quiet, when the town was behind them, and the road had narrowed to 2 ruts running up alongside the creek. "It is. You traveled honest." "Then I had to." "No." He nodded once, as though that were an answer. He had expected and respected. He did not press her. He did not ask what she had left behind, or what name she had left it under, or why. A woman of 39 was riding a coach into a creek country ranch to keep a stranger's house. He kept his eyes mostly on the team and the road, but every little while he turned his head and looked at her, and when he looked at her face, not at her shoulders, not at her waist, not at the place on the seat where her hip pressed wide against the rail at her face. The way a man looks at a person he is making up his mind to know. That was the thing about Holt Calder. She had been on the wagon 5 minutes and she had already noticed it, and once she had noticed it, she could not stop noticing it. He did not flinch. The creek ran beside the road, wide and brown with melt, and the cottonwoods leaned over it, and the magpies racketed. In the bare limbs cattle stood in the bottoms with their heads down and their breath white. Past a long stand of pine the land opened, and on a low rise above the water sat the house, log, and shake-roofed and long, with a porch that ran the full length of it, and a barn behind it bigger than the house, and a corral, and a smokehouse, and a kitchen garden walled in stone against the deer. The chimney on the main house was cold. The chimney on the bunkhouse off to the side smoked. One window on the gable end of the main house showed light. "That's the place," Holt said. "It's good country." It was. She did not answer that. The wagon turned in at the gate, and the dog came out from under the porch, a brindle mutt with a gray muzzle, and walked stiff-legged out to the wheel and sniffed her boot when she set it down, and then leaned its head against her skirt as though it had been waiting for her for a long time. "Belle," Holt said, surprised. "She doesn't take to strangers." "She isn't taking to a stranger," Harper said quietly, and put her hand down on the dog's head. He looked at her then in a different way, for the space of one breath, and then he looked away as a man looks away from something he was not ready to see. And he carried her trunk up the porch steps and held the door for her, and she went into his house. The front room was a man's room, kept by no one. The floor had been swept, but not lately. The cold ashes in the fireplace had a film of dust across them. A rifle hung on pegs above the lintel. A pair of boots stood by the door, with the leather cracked along the instep. On the table under the window sat a tin cup and a plate with the rind of a piece of bacon on it, and a fork laid across the plate, and beside the plate, a Bible with a leather marker in it, and that was all. There was a smell of cold wood smoke and old leather and dust, and a long quiet. Off the front room, through a doorway, lay the kitchen. The door was shut. He did not look at the door. "Your room is back here," he said, and led her past the kitchen door without slowing. Down a short hall and opened a door on the right. The room was small and clean, scrubbed within the past few days by a man's hand. She could tell because the corners had been missed, and there was a narrow bed with a quilt folded at the foot, and a chair, and a small chest of drawers, and a window that looked out on the kitchen garden. On the chest of drawers there was a pitcher and a basin, and a folded towel. On the wall above the bed there was a nail, without a picture on it. He had taken something down before she came. She did not let her eyes rest on the nail. "The men eat at 6, he said. I'll bring your trunk, Mr. Calder. He stopped in the doorway. The kitchen, she said. He did not turn around all the way. He turned his head. Only my wife's kitchen, he said. It's been shut up 4 years. Yes, I haven't been in it. I understand. You'll do what you need to do, he said. I won't stand in the way. He went back down the hall, and she heard him on the porch with her trunk, and she stood for a moment in the little room and pressed her hand flat against her sternum, the way she did to remind her heart to keep its time, and then she took off her gloves and laid them on the chest of drawers and unpinned her hat and went to the kitchen. The door was swollen in the frame. She had to set her shoulder to it. When it gave all at once, and a wash of stale, cold air came out at her, the air of a room that had been breathing only itself for 4 years. And she stepped into it, and stood in the dimness, and waited until her eyes adjusted, and her chest steadied. It was a long kitchen with a stove against the inner wall, and a deep dry sink under a shuttered window, and a work table down the center, and a pantry off the back. The shutters were closed and barred. The stove was cold. On the wall by the stove, on a wooden peg, hung an apron, gray now with dust, but neatly folded over the peg, and clearly hung there by the same hand every day, for years, before it had been hung there for the last time. On the table sat a wooden bowl with a crust of something gone to powder in the bottom of it. On the windowsill sat a dead geranium in a tin can, the leaves crumbled to flakes, the stem still standing. Harper did not weep. She did not stand and grieve. A woman she had never met. She walked the length of the kitchen with her hand trailing along the edge of the work table, and she put her palm flat on the stove top, and felt the cold all the way up through her wrist. And she crossed to the shutters, and lifted the bar and swung them open, and the cold spring light fell into the room in a long slant, and showed her every speck of dust hanging in the air, and she said aloud to the room, and to no one, "All right." She found a broom behind the pantry door. She found a bucket under the sink. She pumped the inside pump 4 times before the water came. And when it came rust-colored, and she let it run until it ran clear. She tied a rag around her hair. She did not take off her traveling dress, because she had nothing else yet, but she tied her sleeves back to the elbow and rolled up her cuffs. She opened the stove and shoveled out the cold ash into the bucket, and she carried the bucket out the back door of the kitchen, onto a little stoop she had not known was there, and spread the ash across the dormant kitchen garden, because ash was good for the soil, and then she came back in and laid the fire. She found kindling stacked dry on the porch where someone had laid it years ago, and stacked again on top of it more recently. She struck a match from the tin on the shelf above the stove. The fire took on the first try. She found the pantry. The pantry was thin, a barrel of flour, half, a canister of cornmeal, near full, a small crock of lard, salt pork wrapped in cloth, hanging from the rafter, a handful of onions in a basket, a stoneware jar of beans, dry, a jug of molasses, dark, a bin of potatoes, sprouted at the eyes but sound, 2 tins of coffee, one open and stale, one sealed, a jar of dried apples, a jar of sage, a jar of bacon grease in the dark of the lower shelf, kept and added to over years by a careful hand. The careful hand had stopped 4 years ago. Whatever Holt had eaten since had come from the bunkhouse cookhouse or from a tin can. She read the pantry the way a banker reads a column of figures. 8 men, she guessed, and Holt, that made 9, and herself, 10. Suppers for 10 on what was on these shelves until next provisioning, however far off that was. She would learn it. She would learn all of it. She put her hand on the flour barrel and tipped it, and rocked it, and judged the weight against the staves. 3 weeks. 3 weeks if she was careful, and 4 weeks if she was clever. The salt pork would carry the beans. The cornmeal would carry the bread. The molasses would carry the men. The dried apples would carry their hearts. She tied on the dead woman's apron. She did it without thinking. And then she stood for a moment with the strings in her hands behind her back, and her chest tight, and then she tied them, because the apron had been left on its peg, and an apron left on a peg was an apron meant to be used. And the woman who had hung it there would not have wanted a kitchen sealed up 4 years on her account. By 4 in the afternoon, the kitchen smelled of wood smoke and hot lard and onion. By 5 it smelled of fried pork and beans, simmering in molasses and pepper and sage. By 5:30 the cornbread was rising in the oven, golden at the edges, the crust setting up the way cornbread crust sets up when you have judged your stove right. And Harper had laid the long pine table in the dining room with the tin plates and the tin cups and the bone-handled forks she had found in the sideboard drawer, 10 places. And a pitcher of water from the pump in the middle, and the lamps wiped clean and lit against the dusk. She had not asked permission for any of it. She had not been told. The men ate at 6. She had set the table for 10 because the contract said housekeeper, and a housekeeper fed the house. And the house, on a ranch in March of 1883, was the men. At 10 minutes to 6, the back door of the kitchen opened, and Holt Calder came in. He stopped in the doorway. He stood there a long moment. She did not turn around. She was at the stove lifting the cornbread out of the oven on a folded square of sacking, and she set it on the back of the stove and crossed her hands on her apron and waited. "You opened the shutters," he said. "Yes." "You laid a fire in the stove." "Yes." "You're wearing her apron." "Yes," she said. "If you want me to take it off, I will." He did not answer for a long time. She could hear the dog out on the porch, and one of the men calling to another across the yard, and the creek running somewhere below the house. "Leave it on," he said. He went out. She let her shoulders down. At 6, the men came. They came across the yard in a loose line from the bunkhouse, hats off as they hit the porch. Boots banged on the boot scraper, voices low. The first through the door was a thin man with gray in his beard, whom she would later know as Eustace. The next was a hand named Pell, who would not meet her eyes. The next was Dorsey, broad-shouldered and red-faced, who came through the door and saw her and stopped short and let his eyes go up and down her once. Slowly, the way a man takes the measure of a horse. He means to bid against, and then walk past her without a word. The next 2 she did not catch the names of yet. The next was a boy of maybe 20, lean and freckled, with a cowlick that would not lie down, who came in behind the others and saw the table set, and the steam off the platters, and the cornbread cooling on the sideboard, and stopped, with his hand still on the doorframe, and said, "Well, I'll be a son of a," and then remembered himself, and shut his mouth, and took off his hat. "Sit down, Cal," Holt said quietly. Behind him they sat. Holt took the chair at the head of the table, a plain, straight-back chair, narrow seat, no arms, and Harper saw him hesitate for half a breath before he sat down in it. And she understood, without him telling her, that it was not his usual chair. He had been eating in the front room for 4 years. He had not sat at the head of this table since. He sat down now because she had set the table. She brought the platter of pork and beans. She brought the cornbread cut into squares, the crust, the deep gold that comes only from a stove brought up slow. She brought a bowl of fried potatoes with onion and pepper. She brought the coffee pot scalded, clean and full. She set them down, one by one, and stepped back, hands folded on her apron, and waited. For a long moment no one moved. Then Eustace, the gray-bearded man, reached for the platter, and served himself and passed it on, and the rest of them ate. They ate without speaking. They ate as men eat who have been fed on bunkhouse beans and burnt biscuit for 4 years and have forgotten that a meal can be a thing prepared rather than a thing endured. They ate seconds. Cal ate thirds. Dorsey ate without looking up. When the cornbread plate came back to her empty, she turned and went to the kitchen and brought out the second pan which she had baked, because she had counted 10 plates, and she knew her men, and she set it down, and Cal said, under his breath, "Lord." Holt ate slowly. He ate as though he were paying attention to each mouthful. He did not speak. When his cup was empty, she filled it. When his plate was empty, he laid his fork across it the way men of his generation laid a fork to say enough, and she took the plate away. When she came back from the kitchen, the men were standing one by one, and putting their hats back on and going out, and each of them, even Dorsey, mumbled something at her as he passed, "Ma'am," from Eustace, and "Thank you, ma'am," from Cal and from Dorsey. A grunt that was nearer to a word than she had expected. Then it was only Holt at the table, and her standing at the sideboard, with the empty coffee pot in her hand. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Yes. That was the best meal eaten in this house in 4 years. Thank you." "There is no call to thank me. I wasn't thanking you for the compliment." He looked up at her. Then he looked at her a long moment. "What were you thanking me for?" "For letting me open the door." He did not answer. He stood up. He carried his own plate and cup into the kitchen, which she had not expected and did not know how to refuse, and he set them in the sink, and he stood for a moment looking at the apron on the peg, which was now hanging on her instead, and at the dead geranium she had not yet had the heart to throw out, and at the stove, which was warm now for the first time in 4 years. And then he said, "Lo, good night, Miss Whitmore," and went out the back door, into the dark. She stood with her hand on the rim of the sink for a long time before she moved. By the end of her first week she knew the shape of the place. She had taken stock of the pantry and the smokehouse, and the root cellar and the kitchen garden, and she had walked the kitchen garden with a stick and turned over the cold earth at 3 corners and found the rows where the dead wife had planted, and she had begun in a small notebook she had brought from Missouri to keep her own household ledger, what came in and what went out, and what remained, in pencil, in a careful hand. By the end of her first week, the bunkhouse hands came up to supper at 6, without being called, and there were always 10 places, and there was always cornbread, and there was always coffee, and Dorsey had stopped looking at her up and down, and had taken to looking past her shoulder when he spoke, which was a kind of progress. By the end of her first week, Cal had taken to lingering at the back step after supper, with a cigarette he never quite smoked, asking her small questions about the weather in Missouri, and how a person made cornbread crust come out that color, and she answered him the way an aunt answers a nephew, plain and short, and he was satisfied. By the end of her first week, she had also seen the books. She had not gone looking. She had been dusting the front room, the room with the cracked boots and the Bible, and she had opened the drawer of the writing desk under the window to set a box of pens straight, and the drawer had held a ledger. She had stood with her hand on the drawer pull a long time. She had told herself it was not her business. Then she had told herself that the contract said housekeeper, and the housekeeper of a ranch, when the rancher was eating salt pork out of a tin in the front room, and his pantry stood thin, and his herd was thinning, had a duty to look. She lifted the ledger out. It was Holt's hand, plain block letters, careful, the columns ruled with a straight edge. The first pages were 5 and 6 years old. The numbers there were the numbers of a working ranch. Cattle sold. Wages paid. Provisioning bought. Feed in winter. Receipts pasted in. The columns added. The numbers in the most recent pages did not add to the story he had been telling himself. There was a quarterly entry, large, neat, regular, marked only M, and it went out each season like clockwork, and it was bleeding the ranch. It was a sum that should have been retiring a debt and was not. She turned back through the pages. She found the original entry. 4 years ago, spring of 1879, loan from A. Marsh, Hollis Creek First Mercantile Bank, a figure, a rate. She put her finger on the rate and held it there. She knew, the way a woman who has read her father's ledgers since she was 12 knew, that the rate was too high. She did not yet know how too high. She did not yet know what the law of the territory said. But she knew the smell of a swollen note when she saw one, and she knew that no honest banker wrote a rate like that on a piece of land like this to a widower deep in grief, unless he meant to take the land and not the money. She closed the ledger. She set it back in the drawer, the way she had found it. She closed the drawer. She stood with her hand on the desk, and she breathed once, slow, all the way in and all the way out, and she went back to her dusting. She did not speak of it to Holt. Not yet. She did not have the law in her hand. She did not have the receipts. She had only an unease, and she had been a woman long enough to know that an unease without paper was a thing men called hysteria and dismissed. So she kept her mouth and her hands moving and her eyes on the small parts of the house that were hers to put in order, and she waited. The barn was hers too, in a way, because the back door of the kitchen looked at it. After supper, after the men had gone, she would carry the slop bucket out to the kitchen garden, and on the way back she would see, through the gap in the barn doors, a lantern burning on the workbench at the far end. Holt did not go to the bunkhouse at night. He did not come into the house either, except to sleep in a small back room she had not yet been in. He went to the barn after supper and he stayed there. The first night, she stood on the back step and watched the lantern for a long minute before she went back inside. The second night, she did the same. On the third night, when she came back from the garden, the wind was right, and she heard faintly the sound of a plane shaving wood. On the fourth night she heard a saw. On the fifth she heard him sanding. She did not go in. He had not invited her. A man's barn was his own at night. But on the sixth night, Cal came up to the back step with his unlit cigarette and watched the lantern with her for a moment and said, around the cigarette, "He's making something." "Yes, won't say what? Then it isn't ours to know." Cal grinned a small grin she had not seen yet. "Boys in the bunkhouse have a theory. I don't want to hear it. Dorsey says it's a chair. Says, it's a chair, he's building too wide." She turned to look at Cal. Then the boy had the grace to look down at his boots. "Dorsey can keep his theories to himself," she said quietly. "And so can the rest of the bunkhouse, Cal. Do you hear me?" "Yes, ma'am." "Tell him I said so." "Yes, ma'am." "And put that cigarette out before you set my back step on fire." "Yes, ma'am." He went. She stood a moment with her hands wrapped together in her apron and her eyes on the lantern in the barn, and she did not let herself imagine it. She did not let herself think the word chair. She had been imagining herself into rooms that were not for her since she was a girl, and she had learned long ago that the imagining cost more than the disappointment. She turned and went inside. In the kitchen, in the lamplight, she stood at the work table and put both her hands flat on it. She lowered her head. She breathed in once. Slow. She breathed out slow. She did not cry. She did not let her face go. She straightened up, and she wiped the table, and she set the bread to sponge for the morning, and she banked the stove, and she went to her room, and she undressed in the dark, and she lay down in the narrow bed, and she said her prayers, and she slept. The friction began in earnest on the morning of the 8th day. She had been at the stove early. She had had the coffee on by 4:30, and the biscuits in the oven by 4:45, because the men rode out at sunup, and the men, she had learned, would eat standing at the back door of the kitchen if she let them. holding their coffee in one hand and a biscuit folded around bacon in the other, and right out chewing. She had been turning the bacon with a long fork and her sleeves to the elbow when Dorsey came in. He came in through the back door without knocking. He came in with his coat collar up and his hat still on, and he crossed the kitchen to the stove and put his hand on the handle of the coffee pot before she could turn from the bacon, and when she stepped to the side to give him room he did not step around her. He shouldered her. He set the bulk of his shoulder against the bulk of her shoulder, and he leaned, deliberately, the way you lean against a piece of furniture you want to move, and he said, "Move, woman." She moved. She moved a half step, no more. She did not look at him. She kept the fork on the bacon. She turned a slice. She turned another. "Make some room," Dorsey said, lower, into her ear. "You take up enough of it." She did not flinch. She did not speak. She turned the next slice of bacon, and she set the fork down on the spoon rest, and she reached past him for the pepper, and ground it once over the pan, and she said evenly, "Mr. Prast? Dorsey, the coffee is right where it always is. You don't need to come through me to reach it." He laughed. He poured his coffee. He drank a long swallow standing there with his hat still on in her kitchen, and he said, around the rim of the cup, "Furniture don't usually answer back." And then Holt was in the doorway. She did not know how long he had been there. He was in his shirt sleeves and his suspenders down the way a man dresses, who has come out of his own back room at the sound of voices, and his hair was wet from the basin, and his face was the face of a man who had heard the last sentence and was deciding, in front of her, what kind of man he was going to be in his own house. "Dorsey," he said. Dorsey turned outside. Holt outside Dorsey. Now. The kitchen went quiet. The bacon hissed in the pan. Dorsey looked at Holt, and Holt looked at Dorsey, and after a long moment Dorsey set his coffee cup down on the work table, hard enough to slop the coffee onto the wood, and walked out the back door and down the steps into the yard. Holt did not follow at once. He stood in the doorway and looked at Harper. He looked at her face. She was at the stove with the fork in her hand and her cheeks high with color and her chin level. And she was not looking at him. "Miss Whitmore. The bacon needs to come off, Miss Whitmore. It'll burn, Mr. Calder. Look at me." She looked at him. He took one step into the kitchen. He did not come any closer. He stood with his hands hanging at his sides and his eyes on her, and he said, plainly, in a voice that was not loud and that carried anyway, "You are not furniture in this house, I know." "Do you?" "I know," she said again quietly. "Calder, the bacon." He nodded once, slow, and went out the back door. She heard him on the porch. She heard the murmur of his voice and the lower murmur of Dorsey's. She did not hear what was said. She took the bacon off the heat. She slid it onto the platter. And she set the platter on the back of the stove, and she covered it with a clean cloth. And she went to the basin, and she washed her hands, and her hands were trembling, and she pressed the heels of them flat against the rim of the basin, until they stopped, and then she dried them on her apron. By the time the men came in for breakfast, Dorsey was not with them. He came in last, late, alone, with his hat in his hand. He did not look at her. He sat at the foot of the table where he always sat, and he ate what she put in front of him. And when the meal was over he stood up and he said, low, in the direction of the platter, "Ma'am, I beg your pardon," and went out. Jill, at her elbow, with a biscuit halfway to his mouth, watched Dorsey go, and then turned and looked up at Harper, and said, soft, around the biscuit, "What did Holt say to him?" "That isn't ours to know," she said. "No, ma'am." "Eat your breakfast, Cal." "Yes, ma'am." That night she carried the slop bucket out to the kitchen garden, and came back and stopped on the back step, and looked at the barn. The lantern was burning at the workbench. The sound coming out of the gap in the doors was the soft, slow rasp of sandpaper on wood. It went on a long time. She listened to it, and she did not let herself think about it. And then she went inside, and she set the bread, and she went to bed. She woke once in the night, she did not know why. The house was still. And she lay in the dark with her eyes open, and she listened, and somewhere out in the barn the lantern was still burning, because she could see the soft seam of light through her window, where it fell across the kitchen garden wall. And she lay in the dark, and she did not think about the chair. And she went back to sleep. The next morning she came around the corner of the kitchen with a basin of water for the steps, and she nearly walked into Holt. He was standing on the back step with a tin cup of coffee in his hand. He must have poured himself, and he had been watching her through the kitchen window. He did not pretend he had not been. "I'm sorry," he said. "I didn't mean to startle you. I didn't see you." "No." She set the basin down on the step. She straightened. She kept her hands on her apron. "You were watching me," she said. He did not look away. "Yes, why you were kneading bread." "Yes. You move your hands like—" He stopped. He looked down into the cup. "Like my mother used to before she was sick." She did not know what to do with that. She did not know what to do with the fact that he had said it without lowering his voice, and without softening it. So she did the thing she always did when she did not know what to do. She kept her hands moving. She picked up the basin again, and she carried it past him, and threw the water across the boards of the porch, and she set the basin down. "Mr. Calder." "Holt." She looked at him. "Holt," she said, testing it, low. It did not feel like her own voice. "You don't have to," he said. "If it's too soon." "It's too soon." "All right, but I'll get there." He nodded once. He drank the rest of the coffee. He held the cup out, and she took it. "Miss Whitmore." "Yes, I want to tell you something." "Yes." He stood looking out at the barn, at the corral, at the long blue line of the mountains beyond the creek. He stood a long time. "Most men," he said finally, "I think, most men would have laughed at the coach driver. About the springs. Yes. I'm not most men." She felt the words go through her like a hand laid against the back of her neck. She did not turn her head. She kept her eyes on the porch boards, where the water was drying in long pale streaks. "No," she said, very quietly. "You aren't." He went to the barn. It rained the 10th day. It rained the 11th. On the 11th evening, Harper sat in her room with the door closed, and the lamp turned low, and a small wooden sewing box open on her lap, and she was trying to mend the long seam of her traveling dress, where it had torn along the side when she sat down too hard on the wagon seat, coming back from the smokehouse the night before. The thread had run out. She had had a small spool, and she had used it on the apron last week, and she had not thought to ask. The dress lay across her knees with the long seam open like a wound, and she sat with the needle in her hand, and the empty spool in her other hand, and she did not cry, but her eyes were wet, and one tear ran down her face, and fell on the back of her hand, and that was the one she had not been ready for. She wiped it off. She wiped her face on her sleeve. She sat very still. She breathed once, all the way in, all the way out. And then there was a soft knock at her door. She did not answer at first. She set the needle in the cushion. She set the empty spool in the box. She closed the box. "Yes," she said, "ma'am." It was Cal's voice, low. "Ma'am, I brought you something." She got up. She opened the door 6 inches. Oh, was in the hall with his hat in his hand, and his hair wet from the rain, and a small paper twist in his fingers. He did not look up at her face. He looked at the floor. "Thread," he said. I saw the dress. Through the window. I wasn't." I wasn't looking. I was going by. I saw the dress on your lap. I rode into the mercantile this afternoon, for the boss anyway, and I asked Mrs. Peck what color thread for a dress like that cow. Black, he said miserably. She said black, ma'am, for a dress like that. I hope it's right. I didn't know how much, so I bought a whole spool. She said a whole spool was 4 cents. He held out the paper twist. She took it. Her hand was steady. His was not. Thank you, Cal. Yes, ma'am. Did you tell Mr. Calder? No, ma'am. Good, ma'am. Yes. He looked up at her then. His eyes were very young and very bright in the lamplight, and the rain had darkened the shoulders of his coat, and he stood in the narrow hall with his hat against his chest, and he said, Ma'am, I'm sorry about the other thing. The chair, what Dorsey said. I laughed. I shouldn't have laughed. No, she said, you shouldn't have. No, ma'am. But you brought thread. Yes, ma'am. Go to bed, Cal. Yes, ma'am. He went. She closed the door. She stood with the paper twist in her hand and her back against the door, and she let her eyes close, and she did not cry. And after a while she sat down again and threaded her needle by the lamplight and mended the long seam of her traveling dress with stitches so small a banker could not have found fault with them. And when she was done, she folded the dress over the chair, and she put out the lamp, and she lay down in the narrow bed, and she slept. The attic she found by accident on the 12th day. She had been looking for a length of muslin to cover the pantry shelves, because the pantry shelves were old wood, and had not been lined in years, and she meant to line them. She had half remembered that on the morning of the second day she had seen a square trap in the ceiling of the hall outside her room. A square trap with a small iron ring sunk into the wood. And she had thought at the time that an attic in a house like this would likely be where extra cloth was stored. She fetched the kitchen stool. She set it under the trap. She climbed up. She was not a woman who climbed easily, but she climbed steadily, and she pushed the trap up with both hands, and it swung back on its hinge with a long sigh of dust, and a wash of cold, dry air came down at her, and she pulled herself up into the dark. The attic was a low, long room under the pitch of the roof, and there was one small window at the gable end, and through the window came enough gray, rainy daylight to see by once her eyes adjusted. There was a trunk against the back wall. There was a rolled rug. There was a hat box. There was a small chest of drawers covered with a sheet, and on top of the sheet, plain in the gray light, sat a stack of 3 account books bound in dark cloth and tied together with a strip of black ribbon. She crossed to them. She knelt. She untied the ribbon. She opened the top book. The handwriting inside was not Holt's. It was a woman's hand. It was small, careful, neat, the letters even. The columns ruled with what looked like the back of a knife. The first page was dated 1877. The first entry was for a bolt of muslin and a pound of nails. The second was for sugar. The third was for a doctor's call. It was a household book. Harper sat down on the floor with the book in her lap. The dust came up around her. She did not feel the cold. She turned the pages slowly. She read the small, careful entries. Lamp oil, salt, a pair of boy's boots for a neighbor's child, a pane of glass for the kitchen window, a length of black bombazine which she understood, with a small soft ache, had been for a morning dress for someone else, someone the wife had been keeping in mind. She turned the pages. In the spring of 1879 the entries changed. Not in handwriting. The handwriting stayed the same. Careful, even controlled. But the entries changed. Beginning in April of 1879, on a fresh page, the wife had begun a separate column headed in the same neat letters, A. Marsh, Note. Below that heading, in a column the wife had ruled herself, She had begun to enter, by date, every payment Holt made on the loan. Each entry had the date. Each entry had the amount. Each entry had a small notation in the margin, cash given Mr. Calder to deliver, or note paid in person by Mr. Calder, Tuesday market day, or paid Mr. Marsh at house, witnessed by Eustace Burke. Witnessed. The wife had written witnessed. The wife had marked, for each payment, the name of the man who had seen it made. Harper turned the page. The column went on. It went on through the summer of 1879 and the fall of 1879 and into the winter, and the last entry in the wife's careful hand was dated the 11th of February 1884, days before. Harper understood without being told. The wife had taken the fever that took her. The last entry was a payment. The last entry was witnessed by Cal. By Cal, who would have been 16 years old then, just hired on. The wife had written, in the margin, Cal Bremer, new hand, present at counter. She sat in the dust in the cold attic light, and she held the 3 books in her lap. And she understood several things at once. She understood that the dead wife had been watching Marsh. She understood that the dead wife had not trusted him. She understood that the dead wife, 4 years ago, had been building a record without telling her husband she was building it, because her husband had been a man who would not have wanted to know. She understood that the record existed. She understood that the record had been waiting in this attic for 4 years. She understood that the dead wife had left her something. She did not cry. She did not stand and grieve a woman she had never met. She bowed her head once in the dim attic light, and she said aloud very quietly, "Thank you, ma'am," to a woman whose name she did not yet know. And then she tied the black ribbon around the 3 books again, and she carried them down the ladder, and she set them on the chest of drawers in her own room, and she covered them with her gray shawl. She did not show them to Holt that night. She did not show them to him the next night either. She had been a woman long enough to know that when you found a thing like that, you sat with it until you understood what you had found, and she sat with it. She read the books at night in her room with the lamp turned low. She copied figures into her own small notebook. She added the wife's column. She added it again. She compared it to the figures she remembered from Holt's ledger in the writing desk. The numbers did not match. The numbers Marsh had been collecting and the numbers the wife had recorded were not the same numbers. The note had been growing in Marsh's books in a way the payments did not justify. Marsh had been calling the note unpaid where the wife had marked it paid. She closed the books. She sat in the lamplight with her hand on the cover, and she breathed once all the way in and all the way out. And she did not yet know what she was going to do, but she knew what she had, and she knew that she was not going to give it back. The chair came into the house at dusk. On the 15th day, it had stopped raining in the morning. By afternoon, the sky over the creek had broken open, and a long band of clean gold light had laid itself down across the bottom land, and the cottonwoods had stood in it dripping and bright. The men had ridden out late to check the cattle in the lower pasture. Cal had gone with them. The house had been quiet. Harper had been in the kitchen all afternoon. And she had killed and dressed 2 of the older hens herself that morning, because the hen house was overstocked and the older hens were not laying, and a stewing hen was a thing that could feed 10 men a long meal, and she had had the birds simmering since 2 o'clock with onion and carrot and a little sage and a great deal of pepper. And the kitchen smelled of broth and butter and rising biscuits, and the long pine table in the dining room was laid for 10. At a little after 5, she heard, faintly from the back of the house, the slow scrape of something heavy being moved across the boards of the porch. She stopped. She set the spoon down on the spoon rest. She wiped her hands on her apron. She did not go to the door at once. She went to the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room, and she stood in the doorway. And she waited. He came in through the front door. He had carried it around the house from the barn. He carried it in his arms, with both arms wrapped around the seat of it, the back of the chair against his chest, and the legs of it ahead of him through the door, and he had to turn it on its side to bring it through, and he turned it gently, the way a man turns a thing he has made with his own hands, and is not yet sure he will set down where he means to set it down. It was oak. It was the color of new oak, sanded smooth as glass, oiled once, the grain running long down the legs and the back. The seat was deep and the seat was wide. The seat was wide enough. The back rose tall and the top rail was carved, gently, in a low curve. There were no arms, because arms would have made the seat narrow, and he had not built it narrow. He had built it for a person. He carried it into the dining room. He set it down at the head of the table. He stepped back. He did not look at her at first. He looked at the chair. He set his hand on the top rail and turned it a quarter inch, one way and then the other, settling it square against the table. And then he stepped back again and stood with his hat in his hand, and his hair damp from the rain in the eaves, and he looked at her. "Miss Whitmore, yes, it's yours." She did not move. She stood in the doorway with her hand on the frame, and the broth was simmering in the kitchen behind her, and the biscuits were rising in the oven, and the long pine table was laid for 10 places, and at the head of the table now sat a chair built in his barn at night for 15 nights, by lantern light, with a seat wide enough to hold her honestly. "Holt," she said. It was the first time she had said the name aloud to him. He heard it. His face did not move, but something in his shoulders set down. "I'm not," she began, and stopped, because she did not yet know what she was not. "It's just a chair," he said low. "It's a chair for the head of the table. It's where the person sits who feeds this house." "Holt, sit in it, Harper," he said her first name. He said it plain, low, without ceremony, the way a man says the name he has been saying inside his own head for some time. She walked to the head of the table. She walked without apology for her step, or for the weight of her on the boards. She put her hand on the top rail of the chair, where his hand had been, and the oak was warm where he had held it. She looked at him across the table. "After supper," she said. "I'll sit in it after supper. The men will be in any minute." "All right, Holt." "Yes, thank you." He nodded once. He did not trust his voice. He turned to set his hat on the sideboard, and he was standing with his back to her and his hand on the sideboard when they heard the hooves. It was 2 horses. They were coming up the creek road at a hard trot, fast for the hour, faster than ranch hands rode in for supper, and the hoofbeats were not the hoofbeats of Holt's men, who came in on tired horses at a walk, the saddles creaking, the men calling to each other across the yard. These were 2 horses ridden by 2 men with a destination. They came up the road, and they turned in at the gate, and they came across the yard at a long, businesslike pace, and they stopped at the porch. Holt straightened. "Sand." His hand stayed on the sideboard a long second, and then he lifted it off. "Stay here," he said. He walked to the front door. He opened it. Harper did not stay. She stepped from the dining room into the front room behind him, and she stood at his shoulder, because she had been a woman in too many doorways in her life to stand back from this one. And through the open door, she saw, in the long gold light of the broken sky, 2 men on horseback in the yard. One of them she did not know. He wore a deputy's tin star and a coat too good for a deputy's wage, and he carried a coiled rope at his saddle. The other she knew without being told. He was a thick-set, smooth-shaven man in a black coat and a black hat, with a watch chain across his vest and a soft, well-fed mouth. And he sat his horse the way a banker sits a horse, squarely, without affection. He was holding a folded paper in his gloved hand, and a hammer, and 4 flat-headed nails. "Mr. Calder," the man said pleasantly. "Aldous Marsh of the Hollis Creek First Mercantile Bank. I believe we have met." Holt did not answer. "This is Deputy Reeves," Marsh said, "of the county. He is here as a courtesy. We will not detain you." He swung down off the horse. He came up the porch steps without haste. He did not look at Harper. He looked at the porch post nearest the door. The square, peeled pine post that held up the porch roof at the corner where the steps came up. He set the folded paper against the post. He set the first nail. He set the hammer to it. He drove the nail in 4 sharp blows. 30 days, he said, when he was done with the first nail and starting the second. "Notice of foreclosure, Mr. Calder, under filing 1761 of the county. The balance due, with interest, is set forth on the face of the notice. I will not embarrass us by reading it aloud. You have 30 days to render the sum in full or to vacate. I am sorry to bring this to your door. I had hoped, given your circumstances, it would not come to this." He drove the second nail, he drove the third, he drove the fourth, he stepped back, he folded the hammer into his coat. "Good evening, Mr. Calder," he said. He touched the brim of his hat in Harper's general direction, without quite looking at her, "Ma'am." He went down the steps. He swung up onto his horse. "Why?" The deputy had not dismounted, had not spoken, had only sat his horse with his hand resting easy on the pommel, and his eyes on Holt's face. The two of them turned their horses and rode back down the yard at the same business-like trot, and out the gate, and down the creek road, and were gone. Holt did not move. He stood in the open doorway with the long gold light falling across him, and the paper nailed to the post just beyond his right shoulder, and he did not lift his hand to take it down. Harper stepped past him onto the porch. She did not ask. She walked to the post. She read the paper without taking it off the nails. She read the sum on the face of it. She read it twice. She read the filing number underneath. She read the name of the silent partner listed under the filing. A name she did not know. A name Holt did not know. She would learn in an hour when she set it before him on the new oak chair's table, and watched his face. The sum on the face of the paper was 3 times what Holt's ledger said he owed. She did not flinch, she did not speak, she did not cry. She laid her hand flat against the porch post above the paper, above Marsh's 4 flat-headed nails, and she felt the wood of Holt's house under her palm, and the cold spring evening on the back of her neck, and the broth simmering in the kitchen behind her, and the chair waiting in the dining room at the head of the table, and she breathed once, all the way in and all the way out. She turned. Holt was still in the doorway. He had not moved. He was holding the empty air where the chair had been in his arms an hour ago, his hands loose at his sides, as though he had forgotten what to do with them. His face was the face of a man who had been buried 4 years and had just begun an hour ago to climb out, and had felt the dirt come down again on his shoulders. She walked back across the porch. She stopped in front of him. She put her hand, lightly, on the back of the oak chair he had built for her, which was just inside the door at the head of the table, where he had set it down, and she said low, so that only he could hear, 30 days. Harper. 30 days, Holt. That is enough. He looked at her then. He looked at her face, the way he had looked at her on the wagon seat the first day, without flinching, without sliding his eyes, and his mouth opened and shut once, and he did not say what he had been going to say. He did not say it because she had already laid her hand on the back of the chair, and she was not taking her hand off. Out on the porch post, the 4 flat-headed nails held the paper square against the wood. Down the creek road the dust of 2 horses was settling in the long gold light. In the kitchen the broth went on simmering, and the biscuits in the oven came to their full rise, and somewhere out on the lower pasture 8 men on tired horses were turning for home and supper. And they did not yet know. Harper Whitmore stood in the doorway of Holt Calder's house, with her hand on the back of the chair he had built for her. And she did not let her hand shake, and she did not let her eyes water, and she did not whisper that she would not be a burden, because she had already, without quite knowing when, stopped whispering that. She only stood with her hand on the oak. And she looked past Holt's shoulder at the paper nailed to the porch post, and she said again, to him, to herself, to the dead wife in the attic, whose ledger lay folded in black ribbon, under a gray shawl on the chest of drawers in the back bedroom. 30 days. And then she went to take up the broth. Holt did not move from the doorway for a long time. He still held the chair, his big hands curled around its arms, as if he had forgotten to set it down, as if setting it down meant something he was not ready to do. Behind him, the kitchen filled with the smell of onion and marrow, and the soft hiss of fat finding the lip of the pot, and the light to the west window, crept across the boards, and touched the edge of the chair's seat, and made the new oak shine like something pulled up out of water. "Holt," Harper said from the stove. "Bring it in." He looked at her then. He had been looking past her, at the porch post, at the white square of paper, and the 4 flat nails. He looked at her, and his mouth moved once before words came. "He nailed it to my house," Holt said. "He did, in front of you. He did that too." Holt set the chair down. He set it down carefully, the way a man sets down a thing he had spent 4 winter nights making in a cold barn, after the lamps in the bunkhouse had gone out. But he set it at the head of the table, square to the wood, and he stepped back from it and looked at it without touching it again. Harper saw him swallow. 30 days, he said. "Yes. He's lying about the sum. He is." "I know that," she said. She lifted the broth from the iron and set it on the trivet and wiped her hands on her apron, and did not turn to him yet, because she wanted him to keep his face to himself another moment. She had learned a long time ago that some men needed to be unwatched while they took a hard low. She put the lid on the pot and adjusted the damper on the stove. And only then did she turn. "Sit down at your table, Mr. Calder," she said. "We are going to eat, and the men are going to eat. And tomorrow morning at first light I am going up to the attic and bringing down a book that Eliza kept. And then you and I are going to read it together." He had not heard his dead wife's name spoken in this house in 4 years. It went through him the way cold water goes through linen. He sat down in the chair on the long side of the table, not at the head, and he put his hands flat on the wood and looked at them as if they belonged to someone he used to know, and the hands came in at full dark, with the mud of the lower pasture on their boots and the smell of horse on them. Cal saw the paper first, because Cal was always first to see what was not supposed to be seen. He stood at the porch rail and read it twice without speaking, and then he came inside without taking off his hat, which he never did. And he stood beside Harper at the stove and said quietly, under the noise of the others, "Ma'am, that on the post." "I saw it, Cal. That ain't a real number." "No, it is not." He looked at her. He was 19 and freckled across the bridge of his nose, and he had called her the first night, exactly what Dorsey had called her, only quieter. He had stopped 2 weeks ago. He looked at her now and said, "What do you need me to do?" "Eat your supper," she said. "Then in the morning, go to the bunkhouse before they ride out, and tell them what you've seen of the books. Not loud. Just plain. 'I ain't seen the books, ma'am.'" "You will." He looked at her a second longer, then he took his hat off. They ate in near silence around the long table that night. 8 men and Holt and Harper, the paper on the porch behind them like a watching thing. No one spoke of it because Holt did not speak of it, and the hands took their cue from Holt the way they had taken every cue from him for 4 years. Harper carried the platter, refilled the cups, set the cornbread down in the middle of the table where every hand could reach without asking, and watched the chair at the head stand empty because Holt had not put her in it, and she would not put herself in it, under that paper. Not tonight, the chair would wait. After the man had gone back across the yard to the bunkhouse, Holt stood up from the table and walked outside. He stood on the porch a long time. Harper let him stand. She washed plates and stacked them, and wiped the table, and banked the stove, and lit a single lamp, and set it on the table beside the chair, and only then did she go out to him. He was looking at the post. "In the morning," she said, "we read." "All right," he said. She did not say what she wanted to say, which was that he should sleep, because she knew he would not. She went back inside, and climbed the narrow stairs, and lay down on top of the quilt in her clothes, and stared at the ceiling boards, and did not sleep either. Somewhere in the night she heard him come in and sit down at the kitchen table, and put his head in his hands. She did not go to him. There were kinds of grief a person had to walk through, alone, and she had walked through her own, and she knew the rule. At first light she went up to the attic. The shawl lay folded on the chest of drawers in the back bedroom, as it had lain for 4 years. Gray wool, fringed, smelling faintly of cedar and of something sweeter underneath. Lavender, perhaps. Or the soap a woman had used, when there had still been a woman to use it. Under the shawl, wrapped in a length of black ribbon and a square of muslin, lay the book. Harper had not moved it since the day she found it. Quote, she had read it through once by candle, and put it back exactly as she had found it because it had not yet been her place to bring it down. It was her place now. She brought it down to the kitchen, and she set it on the table beside Holt's loan papers, which she had pulled from the drawer in the front room without asking, and she sat down opposite him, with the lamp between them, and untied the ribbon. This was Eliza's, she said. Holt looked at the book. He did not touch it. She kept it from the year you married, Harper said. Every dollar in and every dollar out, every payment to Marsh, dated, every witness to the payment named. She signed each entry. She had Mr. Beecham, at the feed store, countersign 3 of them. She had your foreman countersign 2 more. Before he went west, she knew Holt. She was watching him before she died. He laid it flat on the cover, the way he had laid his hand flat on the table the night before. He did not open it. He looked at Harper across the lamp. "Read it to me," he said. So she read it to him. She read him the entry from the spring of 1878, the original sum $1,400, advanced against the south pasture and the creek bottom, had an interest rate written in Eliza's small, neat hand as 10% per annum, which was the lawful territorial maximum and which Eliza had underlined twice. She read him the payment schedule, every quarter $112 of interest and a fluctuating principal as the cattle sold, and she read him the signed receipt slips Eliza had pasted to the facing page, each one stamped by Marsh's own bank, each one initialed by the teller. She read him the year Eliza died, 1879, and the entries that stopped in October in a different ink, because Eliza had been sick by then, and writing slower. And she read him the last entry, dated 3 days before Eliza took to her bed for good. It said, "Paid Marsh, $340, principal and interest, balance now $610. Witnessed by E. Hollis." Holt put both hands over his face. "Eleanor witnessed it," he said through his hands. "She did. Eleanor knows what the balance was." He held his face that way another long moment. When he took his hands down, his eyes were red but dry. That was the thing about Holt Calder. He grieved with his hands and not his eyes. Then he is claiming what? Harper opened the loan papers Marsh had left. "He is claiming a balance of $3,800, she said, "compounded at an interest rate," he has written us 22% per annum, which is more than double what the statute allows. He has backdated 4 years of compounding to make it look as if no payments were made after 1879, which is a lie, because your foreman paid him in your name 3 times in 1880 before he left, and Eliza's book records those payments, and so does the bank's own stamped slip, here and here. He has filed his foreclosure under a county recording you have never seen, naming himself and a silent partner whose name is initials only. A P. Marsh, who I would guess is his brother. His brother is dead. Then his brother's estate, Harper said, which Aldous Marsh controls. The filing is in his own pocket. He has made a paper that says the land is already half owed to a partner Holt Calder never met, so that when the foreclosure goes through, Marsh can take the deed at half price and call it fair. Holt looked at her. He looked at her for a long, quiet time across the lamp. "How do you know all of that?" he said. "I read ledgers, Mr. Calder," Harper said. "I have read them for boarding houses and ranch kitchens and a freight company in St. Joseph, and I have read them for 22 years. A ledger tells a story whether the man who keeps it wants it to or not." He kept looking at her. "Harper," he said. It was the second time he had used her first name in her hearing. He had used it the night before, across the supper plates, quiet, almost to himself. Now he used it to her face. "Yes." "Is there enough here to stop him?" "There is enough here," she said, "to ruin him." He nodded once, slowly. He closed the loan papers. He stood up from the table and walked to the window, and looked out at the creek and at the porch post, and at the morning light coming down over the lower pasture. And he stood there a long time with his back to her, and he said without turning, "Then we ruin him." "Yes," Harper said. Eleanor Hollis rode out that afternoon. She came on a bay mare she had ridden since she was 40, side saddle, in a black wool riding skirt, and a hat that had belonged to her husband, dead now 11 years. She rode up the creek road past the porch post, and looked at the paper without slowing, and rode straight into the yard and dismounted before any hand could come to hold her bridle. She was 68 years old, and her back was as straight as the porch post itself. Harper came out onto the step to meet her, Mrs. Hollis. "Miss Whitmore," Eleanor said, and she walked up the step and took Harper's 2 hands in her own thin, strong ones, and looked her in the face. "I heard about the paper from the boy who carries my mail. I came directly. Thank you for coming." "Do not thank me yet." "Where is Holt?" "In the barn." "Get him." Harper sent Cal. Holt came in from the barn in his shirt sleeves, with sawdust on his forearms. He had been planing the chair smoother because his hands needed work to do. He stopped when he saw Eleanor in his front room. He had not seen her in his front room in 4 years. She had stood in his kitchen the day Eliza died, and she had stood on his porch the day they put Eliza in the ground, and she had not come up the creek road since, because Holt had not asked her to. Eleanor looked him up and down once. "Holt Calder," she said, "you are a damn fool, and I have been watching you be a damn fool for 4 years, and I have held my tongue because grief is grief. But I will not hold my tongue while Aldous Marsh takes this creek. Sit down." He sat down. She told them then what Marsh had done. She told them about the Pomeroy place 2 miles upstream, taken in 1881 on a note Marsh had written for the widow when her husband died, swollen, foreclosed, and now leased back to her at twice the honest rent. She told them about the Vaughn homestead at the head of the creek, gone in 1882, the family on a train east to a cousin in Ohio. She told them about the Briscoes still hanging on, whose note Marsh had called in 2 weeks ago for a sum that did not match anything anyone could account for. She told them she had been writing letters to the Territorial Bank Commissioner for 2 years, and had not had a reply. because Marsh's brother-in-law sat on the commissioner's board. His brother-in-law, Holt said. Aldous Marsh has married into half this territory's paper, Eleanor said. That is why no one has stopped him. That is why he is bold enough to nail a notice to your post. He believes there is no one in Hollis Creek who can stop him. She turned her head and looked at Harper, who was standing by the kitchen door with her hands folded over her apron. He is wrong, Mrs. Hollis, Harper said Eleanor. There is a circuit judge who rides through the territorial seat. Holt says his name is Pruitt. Marcus Pruitt. He is honest. He is the only one of the three of them who is honest. Marsh has bought the other two. How long to reach him? 4 days hard if my boy rides tonight. Send him tonight. Eleanor looked at her another long moment, and then she smiled. It was a small, thin smile, and it changed her whole face. I had begun to wonder, she said, whether Holt was going to bring a woman into this house who could meet what was coming. He has not always chosen well in lesser matters. He has chosen well in this one. She turned to Holt. She will save your land, Holt called her. You listen to her. I am listening, Holt said. Listen harder. She rode out an hour later with a letter Harper had written for her in a clean, even hand, naming the case, naming the sum, naming the statute, and asking Judge Marcus Pruitt to come to Hollis Creek within the 30 days. Eleanor folded the letter into her riding glove. At the porch step she stopped and looked at the post and the paper. Leave that nailed up, she said. Let every man who rides this road see it. When this is done, we will pull the nails out together. That night Cal went to the bunkhouse before the lamps were out. He stood in the doorway, with his hat in his hands, and the 7 other men looked at him, because Cal was the youngest, and he did not stand in doorways with his hat in his hands. He cleared his throat once. I been in the front room, he said. I seen the loan papers. I seen the book Mrs. Calder kept before she died. The number Marsh is claiming ain't the number Holt owes. It ain't even close. He is claiming 3 times. He is claiming under a rate that ain't legal. He has put a partner on the filing that Holt has never met and don't exist. He paused. I thought you ought to know. Nobody spoke for a long time. Then Dorsey, who had shouldered Harper at the stove and called her furniture, who had been the loudest in the yard and the quietest at her table ever since, sat up on the edge of his bunk and put his bare feet on the floor. 3 times, Dorsey said. 3 times. What does she need? Statements, Cal said. Anything you seen, anything you heard Marsh say. Anything you carried for Holt to the bank that Marsh signed for and what he signed for. She is going to put it on paper, and the judge is going to read it. I rode the bank slip into town in '80, Dorsey said. I was the one took it. I watched the teller stamp it. I watched Marsh sign the back of it himself. I will put my name on that. Then come to the house in the morning, before you ride out. I will come tonight. He stood up and reached for his boots. 2 other hands stood up with him. By midnight, Harper had 4 statements written out at her kitchen table, in her clean, even hand. Each one signed at the bottom by the man who had given it. Each one witnessed by Cal and by Holt. She made a copy of each, and then she made a 3rd copy, and she laid the originals in the bottom of Eliza's ledger and tied the ribbon around the whole stack and set it on the new oak chair at the head of the table, as if the chair were itself a kind of safe. She did not sit in the chair, not yet. Marsh came back on the 4th day. He came alone this time, no deputy, on a tall sorrel with silver on the bridle. He dismounted in the yard and walked up to the porch and stood at the post and looked at the paper as if to satisfy himself it was still there. He did not knock. He called out. Calder Holt came out. Harper stayed inside the door where she could hear. I am here to spare you some trouble, Marsh said. Are you? I will write off the note for $2,000 cash, paid by the end of the week. You walk away with your herd. I take the land and the water. You will not find a fairer offer in this territory, and you will not find one from me again." Holt looked at him. "My balance," Holt said, "is $610. Marsh smiled. It was a small, narrow smile that did not reach above his mouth. "Your balance is what the paper says it is. The paper is a lie. The paper is filed. It is filed under a partner who does not exist." The smile thinned further. Marsh looked past Holt's shoulder into the doorway, and his eyes found Harper there, and they stayed on her a moment, and she felt them on her the way she had felt eyes on her whole life, only she did not look away this time. She looked back. Marsh's mouth moved. "Your cook," he said, "has been talking." "My partner," Holt said, "has been reading." Marsh's eyes came back to Holt. "Partner. That is the word I used. You're out of your mind, Calder." "I have been out of my mind for 4 years," Holt said. "I am coming back into it. Get off my porch." Marsh stood another moment. He looked at the post, and at the paper, and at Holt, and at Harper, behind him, in the doorway, and then he turned and went down the steps, and mounted his sorrel without hurry, and rode out at a walk, and at the gate he stopped and turned in the saddle and called back, "You have 26 days, Calder. I will see you in the courthouse. You will see me in the meeting hall," Holt said. "Judge Pruitt is coming." The sorrel did not move for a beat. Then Marsh touched its flank and went on. Harper stepped out onto the porch and stood beside Holt and watched the dust settle in the road. "He did not know about Pruitt," she said. "He knows now." "Good." Holt looked at her sidelong. "You did not flinch when he looked at you?" "No." "He meant you to." "I know what he meant." Holt nodded slowly. He looked at the post again, and at the paper, and at the 4 flat nails. "I'm not going to be most men about this, Harper," he said. "I won't sit in a room and let him eat my house." "I know." That was the only time he said it. The pressure came on then. A freight wagon Holt had hired from Clearwater was turned back at the county line on the morning of the 8th day, the deputy citing a paper. Holt had never been served. 2 merchants in town who had carried Holt's account for years sent boys out to the ranch with polite written notes saying they could no longer extend credit. The feed store would still sell to Holt, but for cash only, and at a price, half again, what it had been the month before. Mr. Beecham wrote at the bottom of the bill in his own hand, "I am sorry, Holt, he has my paper too." A rumor went around town that Holt had taken in a woman of bad character who had cleaned out his strong-box, and an honest woman at the church sent a quiet message through Eleanor that the story was being put about deliberately, and by whom. Harper read each thing as it came and set it down on the table, and did not speak of it. She fed the men. She fed Eleanor when Eleanor rode out, which was every second day now. She fed 2 of the Pomeroy widow's sons when they came up the creek with a wagon of split wood as a gift, having heard and would not be paid. She fed Mr. Dabber, Beecham's apprentice boy, when he rode out with a sack of cornmeal hidden under a tarp because Beecham had said he could not sell, but had not said he could not give. She made the flour barrel stretch. She made the bacon stretch. She thinned the soup with the last of the dried beans, and thickened it with cornmeal, and no man at her table left hungry, and no man at her table ate badly, and no man at her table did not know what she was doing for him. On the 12th night Holt came in from the barn, and stopped in the kitchen doorway, and watched her at the stove, and he said, quietly, "The way a man says a thing, he has been holding behind his teeth for a week." "Harper, yes." "Sit down at the table a minute. The bread will keep. Sit down." She wiped her hands and sat. He sat opposite her, the long way, as he had on the first night the chair was in the room. The chair stood at the head between them, empty, the ribboned ledger sitting on the seat where she had left it that morning when she carried Eleanor's papers to it. "I have been counting," Holt said. "Counting what?" "Days." He looked at her. "You have been in this house 31 days. I have not paid you yet. I owe you wages." "You do not owe me wages," Holt called her. "I do." "You do not. You have fed me and housed me, and you are about to lose your land, and I am not going to take $1 from you for cooking your supper while we save it. I am not asking you to take $1. What are you asking?" He looked at the chair between them. He looked at the ledger on its seat. He looked at her. "I am asking you to sit in it," he said. Harper did not answer for a moment. "Not tonight," she said gently. "Why?" "Because there is a paper on the porch post," she said. "And I will not sit in that chair while there is a paper on that post. When the paper comes down, I will sit in it. Not before." He nodded slowly. "All right." That was the only word he could find. He sat with her at the kitchen table, and they ate together, the two of them, with the chair empty between them. And the bread came out of the oven, and she sliced it thick and buttered it, and pushed half across to him, and they ate without much talking. And somewhere out under the bunkhouse window, Dorsey was telling Cal a story about a horse he had owned in Kansas, and the lamp on the table burned steady and low. Eleanor came again on the 18th day with the word they had been waiting for. Marcus Pruitt would convene at the meeting hall on the 28th day, 2 days inside the foreclosure deadline. He had sent word ahead that he would hear the matter formally, that he would take sworn testimony, and that he would be accompanied by the territorial clerk, who was a separate office from the bank commissioners and incorruptible by reason of being 81 and indifferent to threats. 28th, Holt said. 28th, Eleanor said. "You have 10 days. Harper laid the ledger out on the table that night, and Holt sat at her right, and Eleanor sat at her left, and they went through it the way a general goes through a map. Harper had bound Eliza's book with fresh ribbon and tabbed every entry with a strip of paper marked in pencil. She had transcribed the relevant entries onto a separate sheet in a clean hand the judge could read at a glance. She had written out the territorial statute on usury, copied from a book Eleanor had brought from her late husband's law shelf, and she had marked the section on maximum lawful interest with a red string. She had stacked the 4 hand statements, with Beecham's bill at the bottom, and the Pomeroy widow's deposition, which Eleanor had ridden up the creek to take herself, on the top. She had triplicated everything, and bound each set in its own ribbon, one for Pruitt, one for the territorial clerk, one for Holt. Eleanor turned a page of Eliza's ledger and rested her hand on it. "She knew," Eleanor said quietly. "She knew he was going to do it. She told me once on the porch that she did not trust him, that she was keeping a book of her own. I did not understand at the time what she meant to do with it. I think she meant to do exactly what you are doing with it now, Harper. Then we will finish what she started." "Yes," Eleanor said. "We will." Holt did not speak. He sat at Harper's right, with his hand on the table near hers but not touching, and he listened. After Eleanor had gone, Harper looked at him. "You are quiet tonight." "I am listening to the two of you talk about my dead wife in my kitchen," Holt said, "and I am finding that it does not hurt the way I was afraid it would. What does it feel like?" He thought about it. "It feels like a door I left shut," he said, "for no good reason." The morning of the 28th day broke gray and cool. Harper had not slept, and she dressed in her better wool, a dark plum that Eleanor had pressed for her the day before, and she pinned her hair up with the comb that had been her mother's, and she ate 2 biscuits standing at the kitchen counter, because she would not be hungry in that hall, and she would not be light-headed at that bench. She wrapped Eliza's ledger in muslin, and tied the ribbon, and put it in a leather satchel, Eleanor had brought from town. She put the statements in. She put the statute in. She put the loan papers in. She closed the satchel and set it on the chair at the head of the table, and stood and looked at the chair a long moment. Soon, she told it. Holt drove her to town in the wagon, with Cal riding behind on the dun. Dorsey and two of the hands had ridden in at dawn to hold seats. The meeting hall was the largest building in Hollis Creek. A tall plank room with a stove at the back and a small platform at the front, and 40 straight benches in 5 rows. And by 9 in the morning every bench was full, and there were men standing along the walls 3 deep. Marsh was at the front, on the right, with 2 lawyers from the territorial seat in dark suits. Men Harper had never seen, men whose faces did not change when the door opened. Pruitt sat at a plain table on the platform, with the territorial clerk at his elbow. He was a small, thin man, with white hair and eyes, the color of slate, and when he saw Holt come in with Harper, he stood up briefly and inclined his head and sat back down. That was a thing Harper noted. The judge had stood. He called the matter to order at 10. He read the foreclosure notice, aloud the sum, and the rate, and the filing, and the room shifted, because half the men in it had not known the sum. He read it without inflection, in the voice of a man reading a hymn. When he had finished, he set the paper down. "Mr. Marsh," he said, "you will speak first." Marsh's senior lawyer rose. He was a tall man with a smooth jowl and a watch chain across his vest, and he stood with the easy posture of a man who had stood in many rooms like this and had never lost. "Your Honor," he said, "Jestin, this is a straightforward matter of a defaulted promissory note executed in 1878 by Holt Calder in the sum of $1,400, on which compounding interest at the contracted rate of 22% per annum has accumulated for 4 years without payment, bringing the present balance, including filing and counsel fees, to $3,800. The note is regular, the filing is regular, and the foreclosure is properly noticed. Mr. Calder has no defense at law. He has, we understand, retained, and here he allowed himself a small dry smile, the services of his cook to argue his arithmetic. We are content to let the cook speak. The numbers will not change because she has read them. The room did not laugh, which was something. A few men shifted on the benches. Cal, on Harper's left, made a small sound in his throat. Pruitt looked at the lawyer without expression. Then he turned his eyes to Holt. "Mr. Calder, do you have counsel?" "I have a partner," Holt said. "She will speak for the both of us. Her name, Harper Whitmore." "Miss Whitmore," Pruitt said. "Approach the bench, please." Harper stood up. The bench creaked when she stood, and she heard a man somewhere at the back make a sound under his breath, and she did not turn her head. She walked up the center aisle in her plum wool, with the leather satchel in her left hand, and her right hand free, and she did not hurry, and she did not lag, and she did not apologize for her step. She walked the way Eleanor had walked up her porch step. Straight at the bench, she set the satchel on the rail. She opened it. She drew out the 3 documents she meant to lay before the judge, and she laid them down side by side. The loan papers on his left, Eliza's ledger in the middle, the marked statute on his right. She did not raise her voice. She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. "Your Honor," she said, "the note, Mr. Marsh's counsel has described to you was indeed executed in 1878, in the sum of $1,400, and the rate written on the face of the original instrument is 10% per annum, not 22. The instrument is here. Marsh's filing represents the rate as 22, which is double the lawful territorial maximum, and which does not appear on the original note. That's the first thing." Pruitt was already reading. "The second thing," Harper said, "is that Mrs. Eliza Calder, before her death in October of 1879, kept a household ledger of every payment made against this note. Each payment is dated, each is witnessed, each is matched to a stamped bank slip from Mr. Marsh's own institution, which slips are pasted into the ledger at the corresponding pages. Mrs. Hollis countersigned 3 of those payments. Mr. Beecham of the feed store countersigned 2. Mr. Holt Calder's foreman countersigned 2 more in 1880 after Mrs. Calder's death. The total of those payments against the lawful rate leaves a balance on this note, today, of $610. Not $3,800. Pruitt was reading. "The third thing," Harper said, "is that the county filing under which Mr. Marsh has noticed this foreclosure names a partner, A. P. Marsh, who Mr. Marsh has represented to this community as a separate financial party. P. Marsh is the estate of his deceased brother, which Mr. Aldous Marsh himself administers. No separate party exists. The filing is a fiction designed to permit Mr. Marsh to take this deed at half value and resell the other half to himself. The filing is here. You may read it." She stopped. She had laid out everything she had come to say, and she had said it without lifting her voice, once, and the room behind her had gone perfectly still, the way a room goes. Still when it understands at the same moment that a thing it had thought was settled is not settled at all. Pruitt read for a long time. He read the original note first, all the way through, holding it up to the light at the rate line and laying it back down. He read Eliza's ledger, turning the tabbed pages one by one, lingering at the pasted slips, lingering at Eleanor's signature, lingering at the last entry. He read the statute and the marked section. He read the county filing, slowly, twice. He read the forehand statements. He read Beecham's bill. He read the Pomeroy widow's deposition. And at that one he closed his eyes for a moment before he opened them again. He set the papers down. He looked at Marsh. "Mr. Marsh," he said, "stand up." Marsh stood. He was paler than he had been when the hearing began. His lawyer started to rise with him, and Pruitt lifted one thin finger, and the lawyer sat back down. "Mr. Marsh," Pruitt said, "is the rate on the face of this original note 10%? Marsh did not speak. "Mr. Marsh, Your Honor, is the rate on the face of this original note 10%? Yes or no?" "Yes," Marsh said. "Calder's wife pays $790 of principal and interest against this note between 1878 and 1879, recorded in this ledger, and stamped by your bank." A pause. "Yes." "Did Mr. Calder's foreman pay an additional $560 against this note between January and August of 1880, recorded in this ledger, and stamped by your bank?" A longer pause. "Yes." "Is there a living person on this earth, Mr. Marsh, whose name is A.P. Marsh?" Marsh looked at the floor. "No, Your Honor." The room exhaled. It was almost a sound. Pruitt sat back. He folded his hands on the table. "The note as represented in the foreclosure notice is voided," he said. "The county filing of partnership is struck as fraudulent. The true balance of the original obligation is fixed at $610, payable on a schedule to be agreed between Mr. Calder and any lawful lender of his choice, which will not be Mr. Marsh. The foreclosure notice nailed to Mr. Calder's porch is rescinded as of this minute. The deed to the Calder property is clear." He paused. "Further, Mr. Marsh, in light of the additional matters set forth in the deposition of Mrs. Pomeroy and the testimony I expect to take in this hall over the next 2 days, regarding the Vaughn and Briscoe accounts, I am ordering your banking license suspended pending a full territorial review, and I am informing the clerk to forward the entire record of these proceedings to the territorial attorney for consideration of criminal charges. You will surrender your charter to the clerk before you leave this hall." Marsh sat down. He sat down slowly, and he sat down hard. as if a string in him had been cut. Pruitt looked at Harper. He looked at her for a long moment over the bench. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "The territory." "Thanks you." He inclined his head to her again. The second time he had done so, the clerk was already writing. It was Eleanor who stood then. She rose from her bench in the second row, in her black wool and her dead husband's hat, and she stepped out into the aisle and walked up to where Harper stood at the rail. She did not look at Pruitt, and she did not look at Marsh. She turned and faced the room. "I am going to say a thing," Eleanor said, "and I am going to say it once, because I am too old to repeat myself. And I want every man and every woman in this hall to hear me." The room was quiet. "My husband and I founded this town in 1856, Eleanor said. "We named it after the creek that runs through it, because the creek is what makes the town possible. Without the water there is no Hollis Creek. There are dry stones and an empty road. Aldous Marsh has spent the last 4 years quietly trying to take the creek for himself. Parcel by parcel, family by family, by means I will not now describe because the judge has just described them better. He nearly succeeded. He would have succeeded if Holt Calder had been left to face him alone, because Holt has been a grieving man, and a grieving man is half a man at best, and we, his neighbors, have let him grieve too long without going to him. I am ashamed of that. I will not be ashamed of it again." She turned slightly so that she was looking at Harper now, not at the room. "This woman," she said, "came to Hollis Creek 30 days ago on the stage from St. Joseph. She was met at the boardwalk with a joke about her body, and the man who told the joke is sitting in this hall, and I will not name him because his wife is sitting next to him, and she is a friend of mine. Harper Whitmore walked past that joke, and got into Holt Calder's wagon, and went up the creek, and opened a kitchen that had been shut for 4 years. And she fed the man at his table, and she read his books, and she found the truth in them, and she found Eliza Calder's book in the attic, and she brought it down, and she has, in 30 days, with no weapon, and no shout, and no threat, saved this creek." Eleanor's voice did not lift. "She has saved the Pomeroy place, and she has saved what is left to be saved of the Briscoe place, and she has saved the memory of the Vaughns, because their ruin will be on the record now. She has saved my town. She has saved Holt Calder's land. She did it with a ledger and a statute and her own clear head." Eleanor paused. "I want it said in this hall, in front of the judge and the clerk and every man here, that Harper Whitmore is the woman who saved Hollis Creek. I will not have her called anything less ever again in any room I am standing in. That is what I came to say." She turned, and she put her thin, strong hand on Harper's arm briefly, and she walked back to her bench, and she sat down. The room did not applaud. It was not that kind of room. But men took their hats off, all down the benches, one after another, and they did not put them back on for a long time. Dorsey took his off, and held it against his chest as if he were at a funeral, which in a way he was. Cal had already taken his off. He had been holding it since Harper walked up the aisle. Pruitt struck the bench softly with the flat of his hand. "This hearing is adjourned on the Calder matter. We will reconvene at 1 o'clock on the Pomeroy and Briscoe matters. Mr. Marsh's charter to the clerk before he leaves the hall." Holt stood. He had not moved through any of it. He had sat in his bench with his hands on his knees, and he had not moved when Pruitt voided the note, and he had not moved when Eleanor stood, and he had not moved when Eleanor named Harper. He stood now. He walked up the aisle to where Harper was gathering Eliza's ledger back into the satchel. He did not say anything. He stood beside her at the rail, and when she had closed the satchel and was ready to turn, he took her elbow gently in his big hand and walked her down the aisle. Men shifted on the benches to let them pass. 2 of them touched Holt's sleeve as he went by. Beecham, near the door, reached out and took Harper's free hand briefly, and pressed it and let it go. Outside the hall, the gray morning had broken open into clean blue. The wind off the creek was cold and clear. Holt did not let go of her elbow until they reached the wagon, and then he handed her up onto the bench with both hands, the way he had handed her up the first day, and he stood at the wheel a moment with his hand on the wood. And he looked up at her on the bench, and his face was open the way it had not been open in 4 years. "You are not the cook in there." He said, "No. You are not most women, either." "No," she said. "I'm not most men, Harper," he said. I think we both have known that. It was the only time he said it to her face. He drove them home, up the creek road in the long blue afternoon. They did not speak much. There was nothing to say yet that needed saying, outdoors. At the gate he climbed down and walked up onto the porch, and he took out his knife, and he pried the 4 flat nails one by one out of the post, and he caught each nail in his palm and put it in his pocket, and he took the white square of paper down, and folded it once, and put it in his pocket with the nails. And he stood at the post a moment with his hand flat against the wood where the paper had been. Harper stood at the bottom of the step and watched him. "Come in," she said, "supper." She made supper the way she had made every supper for 30 days, and the hands came in from the lower pasture as they had every night, and they ate. Only this night Eleanor was at the table, and the Pomeroy widow's 2 sons were at the table, and Beecham had ridden out with a roast of beef and a sack of good white flour as a gift, and he was at the table. And the room could not hold any more chairs, and the hands brought stools from the bunkhouse and sat on them, and the long table was full from end to end. The chair at the head was empty. Harper carried plates and refilled cups, and moved between the kitchen and the dining room, with the lightness of a woman who had laid down a weight she had been carrying for 30 years, and no one called her furniture, and no one shouldered her at the stove, and the men at her table watched her pass. When the meal was nearly through, Holt stood up from his place on the long side of the table. He stood up holding his cup. "Harper," he said. She stopped in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room with a platter of cornbread in her hands. "Yes, sit down." She set the platter on the table. She wiped her hands on her apron. She walked the length of the table slowly, past Eleanor and past the Pomeroy boys, and past Beecham, and past Cal, who pulled the chair out for her himself, and she sat down in the chair Holt had built for her, the wide-seated oak chair he had sanded smooth on 4 winter nights in the barn, and the chair held her honestly and easily, and she settled into it without apology, and without making herself smaller in it, and she put her hands on the arms of it, and she looked down the long table at Holt at the foot, and Holt at the foot raised his cup to her, and every man and woman at that table raised theirs. Cal sat at her right. No one said anything for a long moment. Then Eleanor said, "That is a fine chair," Holt called her. "It is," Holt said. "It is finely being sat in." Later, after the dishes were done and the hands had gone back to the bunkhouse, and Eleanor had been driven home in Holt's wagon by Dorsey, Holt and Harper went out onto the porch together. The night was clear, and full of stars over the creek. The post stood bare beside them. Holt leaned on the rail. "Harper?" "Yes." "I want to ask you something, and I want to ask it plain, because I have not asked you anything plain since you got off that stage, and I should have." "Ask it?" He turned and faced her. "Stay," he said. "Not as a housekeeper. Not on a contract. Not because I owe you wages. Stay because this is your house now, and we both know it. I am asking you to stay." Harper looked at him. She did not lower her eyes. She had spent her whole life lowering her eyes when men spoke to her plainly, because plain speech from men had usually meant something she was supposed to apologize for, and she had stopped lowering them sometime in the last 30 days without quite noticing when, and she did not lower them now. "I will stay," she said. "I will tell you what I need. Tell me." My name on the deed. Not as wife, as partner, half and half. Written and filed. Done. My ledger on the desk in the front room. Yours beside it. We keep them both, and I read yours when I please, and you read mine when you please. And we do not run this place by one set of eyes again. Done. My chair at the head of the table, always. That chair, in that place, with my plate on it, every meal, in this house, for the rest of my life. Done. And no more whispered apologies in your house, not from me, and not from any other woman who walks through that door. I have whispered them my whole life, Holt Calder. I am finished. I will not raise my voice, and I will not need to. But I will not apologize for the size of me, or the step of me, or the space I take in any room of this house. And I will not stand by while it is done to another woman in my hearing. Done. He had said it before she finished. He said it again when she finished, so that she would hear it twice. Done. Harper. All of it. Before you said it. He stepped toward her. He did not move quickly. He stopped close enough that she could see the lines at the corners of his eyes. The lines 4 winters of grief had cut there, and the new look in them that was not grief at all. He took her hand. He took it carefully, the way he had set the chair down on the night Marsh came up the road, the way a man handles a thing he has finally been allowed to handle. He raised her hand and he laid it against his cheek, against the side of his face that had not been touched in 4 years, and he held it there with his own hand over it, and he closed his eyes. Harper, he said, will you marry me? Yes. She said it without lowering her eyes. She said it without whispering. She said it the way Eleanor had stood up in the hall and named her, plain and clear and at full voice, and Holt opened his eyes and he looked at her, and she looked back. He did not kiss her. Not yet. There was time for that. He held her hand against his face a long moment, and then he lowered it, still holding it, and he said, "Come inside. It is cold." She let him lead her in. The lamp was burning low on the kitchen table. The chair stood at the head of the table in the dining room beyond, wide and dark, and waiting in the lamp's edge of light. She looked at it once, and she went past it to bank the stove for the night, because there were biscuits to set for the morning, and there were men to feed at first light, and Harper Whitmore had a kitchen to run. In the days after, the news of the hearing went down the creek and out to the territorial seat and back again. The Pomeroy widow's case was reopened and her lease rolled back to honest rent. The Briscoes kept their land. The territorial attorney came to Hollis Creek and took a full week of testimony in the meeting hall. And at the end of it, Aldous Marsh's bank was placed in receivership, and his charter formally pulled and his name struck from the rolls. He was given the choice of jail in the territorial seat or removal from the territory, and the choice was put to him on a Thursday morning at the Hollis Creek courthouse. Holt rode out that afternoon with $40 in cash in his coat pocket. He met Marsh at the territory line at sundown. Marsh was on the sorrel still, but the silver had been sold off the bridle, and his coat was thinner than it had been, and his face had gone gray. He sat the horse and looked at Holt without speaking. Holt rode up beside him. He did not dismount. "Stage fare to Denver," Holt said. He held out the money. Marsh stared at it. "I do not understand you, Calder. I'm not asking you to." Marsh took the money. His hand shook a little when he closed it around the bills. He looked at Holt, and he opened his mouth and closed it. "Tell her," Marsh said, finally. "Tell her," what Marsh did not answer. He turned the sorrel and rode south at a walk, and Holt sat his own horse and watched him until the dust of the sorrel was gone in the dusk, and then he turned back toward home. He did not tell Harper what Marsh had said, and Harper did not ask. The chair stayed at the head of the table. In the dining room that fall, with the windows open to the late warm afternoons, and the creek running full from the September rains, Harper sat in it for every meal. She sat in it when Eleanor came to supper, which was every Sunday now. She sat in it the day the circuit minister came up the creek to marry her and Holt in the front room, with Cal as witness on her side, and Beecham as witness on Holt's, and Eleanor giving her away in lieu of a father long dead, and the chair waiting at the head of the table for her to sit in when the words were said, and the wedding supper began. She sat in it the day her name was filed on the deed at the county office. In town half and half, written and witnessed, with Holt beside her at the clerk's window, saying nothing, because there was nothing to say that her name on that paper did not say better. She sat in it the day Cal asked her blushing red to the roots of his hair, whether she thought he might court Mr. Beecham's daughter. And Harper said she thought he might, and that he might also wash his neck before he went to ask. She sat in it the night a hard early snow came down the creek, and Holt brought in an armload of dry oak for the stove, and looked at her across the table in the chair he had built for her, and shook his head as if it's something he could not get over. "I keep thinking you will get smaller in it," he said. "And you do not." "I am not going to, Holt." "I know that," he said. "I am glad of it." She had never been a burden. She had carried that word her whole life, pinned to her like the white square of paper Marsh had nailed to the porch post, and a man in Hollis Creek had pried it out of her with the 4 flat nails of it one cold morning, and put the nails in his pocket, and built her instead a chair wide enough and deep enough and honest enough to hold her as she was. She had never been invisible. Eleanor Hollis had said so in a hall full of men, and the men had taken off their hats, and the territory itself had thanked her by the mouth of its judge, and her name was on the deed of the land the creek ran through, and her ledger lay on the desk in the front room beside her husband's. And her chair sat at the head of her table, where her husband had set it for her with his own hands. She had only been waiting, all those years, for a room built to hold her. The room had been built. She sat in it. She took up every inch of space the chair gave her, and the chair, and the room, and the man at the foot of the table held her honestly. And she had earned every acre of it, and she did not whisper any more, and she did not apologize. And she was seen.